these accusations that the Jews killed Christ. Think about this. The national symbol, let's say, of Hezbollah is a rifle. That's what's on their flag. The national symbol of Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, is a sword. That's what's on their flag. The national symbol of Israel is the shield. It's the Star of David. The symbol of our people is not a weapon of war. It's an instrument of defense. The thing that most embodies our entire ethos is not harming others. It's, again, creating a better world. This is fundamental to our tradition for thousands of years. And so the idea that our national anthem would be the Hatikva, would be the hope, I should say it's the Israel's national anthem. It's as old as time, right? We face it for thousands of years. First it was, after the death of Christ, there were these accusations that the Jews killed Christ and that the Jews weren't a real religion because we didn't accept Christ and then we didn't accept Muhammad. So you have this, the Jewish religion isn't legitimate, and that was the basis for the Crusades, which is at Tish B'Av, which, remembers the expulsion. We had inquisitions. We had all these horrible things. And then, after the Age of Reason, it was, maybe, and they realized that the sun doesn't revolve around the earth and the earth isn't flat. Then it was, maybe Judaism is okay as a religion, but it's the Jewish race that isn't legitimate. And then we saw kind of antisemitism metastasize into this kind of race-based form of hate, which of course exploded with the Shoah. And then after the tragedy of that, the injustice of that was exposed.
Well, hello there. Thank you for joining me again today. The last show I said, we're going to talk about when they left Russia and Poland to found Israel. Well, actually, there's something we need to discuss before that all happened, because there's a group called B'nai B'rith. It's a Jewish organization. And then you've also heard of ADL, which is the Anti-Defamation League, also a protect Jewish group, run out of the United States, by the way. Many confuse the ADL with a Jewish organization, but it's in fact American. So, anyway, before they left, how does all get hooked up? This is why I'm always talking about learn the root of these things, right? So before all this happened, before they founded the Zionist group, before all this stuff happened, they actually founded this group called B'nai B'rith. And out of B'nai B'rith came the Anti-Defamation League, or the ADL. So this really intersects before we can talk about when all the people left the Eastern European area to go to found Israel. Because this is, in fact, the beginning stage. And the guy in the intro was yapping about what is on their flag, saying, Iran has a sword, shows how evil they are. Well, first of all, when the Middle East was reorganized during Psychopath, all of those flags were in fact designed by the US and the UK. So the reason Iran has that sword is because the US and the UK people designed all those flags, and all those flags, the crescent, the moon, and all that are actually satanic. So let's take a quick look here. Well, our flag is good because we have the Star of David. Well, actually, the man that was speaking is the current guy in charge of the ADL. The so-called Star of David is actually the ancient Star of Rephan, Remphan, a pagan Assyrian god. All 22 letters of the Aramaic, Assyrian, Babylonian alphabet are found in the Star of David, plus the 2 final letters also. These are not Hebrew letters. They are Syrian Aramaic, the language of Babylon. The star is completely Assyrian Babylon. So that's where that star came from. So welcome to today's show. We're going to take a closer look at some of these things that very rarely get mentioned. And there's also how did the Jewish networks like B'nai Birth, the rise of Zionism, and the Anti-Defamation League, or the ADL, even their battles with anti-Semitism and the Ku Klux Klan, how did this all happen? Well, this is a ball of wax that I will be able to unwind today because it really shaped it all, okay? And together we're going to trace this path from Eastern Europe turmoil of the 19th century to the Declaration of Israel in 1948, because it has a very interesting path. Because this B'nai Birth, they got started before the whole Zionism thing, okay? But before I get started, a couple of things. I have a lot of information down below and on my website, earpods, because they have made devices so slim. What has been sacrificed? Well, the audio. That's why no one can hear on these devices. That's why it always amazes me when people complain about the audio because, well, first of all, I do apologize. The audio at the end when the song plays really comes on quite loud, but I don't have a. I started this whole adventure 8 years ago with actually a show producer and all that, and I'm ending it holed up in my house in Nebraska and being attacked by the government. So I'm really doing the best I can. But anyway, we need to discuss those ear pods, and I don't have the ability to go into it in great detail, but I have shown you in great detail why, if you have children involved or old people, do not put them in ear pods. Absolutely. Even though we're winding up the game board, we don't want everybody end up with extra cancer that they're not going to get already from sitting inside their home. So the AirPods really bring in a whole new level of, and when you read the piece through, they talk about, they say it's non-ionizing. Well, they say that about a lot of things. Ionizing is the one you want to look for, the dangerous stuff, okay? I would suspect, now I'm just suspecting, right? I would suspect that they are, in fact, leaching ionized radiation directly into your brain. So, what I use, and so anyway, so Silicon Valley, everybody's always bragging about all this tech. They have not been introducing new technology per se, if anybody was paying attention. They have just been making design feature changes. Like, for example, to get more money every year out of iPhone people, they just keep making it slimmer and slimmer, right? Well, something's got to go. What goes? Well, the audio gets compromised. So, yeah, because those slim designs are actually just design features. They're not technology increases. And the more they slim those things down, the more they're taking away the audio. So yeah, I'm on probably my. I've had several laptops over my lifetime, and I haven't been able to hear out of any one of them. Okay, um, but the Chromebook, to be fair, the Chromebook. Uh, if you're just going to be cruising the net and doing setting up your own investigative shop in your own living room or bedroom today with all the information I'm providing you with, well, those Chromebooks do have pretty good audio. So, but in general, I use a $12 USB plug-in speaker because I don't want anything around my head. I've had to get rid of the obvious things, right? I don't use my microwave, and I'm not going to be using earpods that can jack more radiation into my brain. So, particularly when it comes to children, the children cannot consent. You are their caretaker. Get them away from those earpods. Okay, so I talked in the past and I slipped past it, so let me readdress it. I didn't mention, I talked about they changed the calendar. And it's interesting because it's around the same time frame we're looking at. What they do, these historians, is they have all these categories of times, which works well, I guess, if you're talking to other historians. But when they say things like, well, that was a medieval period, well, in my brain, it was only the 1200s, right? Because my brain connects the 1200s to the 1400s to when a lot of stuff got started to blah, blah, blah. So my brain kind of connects it all in a row, right? So when they throw around these slogans and things like, well, during the medieval period, they were killing everybody and doing this and that. Well, I prefer to look at them as dates because whenever they introduce all that extra jargon, it just removes us regular people from really being able to grasp this stuff. Because when I think medieval period, I think of those silver statues they had with shields and stuff and swords and stuff. So it's really a lot of it's in the wording. So, but this is around the same time frame. So why I don't know. But here's the deal: The older Julian calendar, which was introduced by Julius Caesar in 46 BCE, had a leap year system that slightly overestimated the length of the solar year. What I think they're doing is this: they made all this stuff up, right? When they wrote the Bible and all their history books and stuff. So I think some of these things are simply just corrective actions because somebody, when they made all this stuff up, made an obvious mistake that got pointed out to such a degree they had to go back and correct it. I think it's really as simple as that. But let me keep reading. So that's the claim, that they had a leap year system that slightly overestimated the length of the solar year. The error created about 11 minutes per year and caused the calendar to drift out of sync with the seasons. By the 1500s, by the time frame we're in, the spring equinox was falling around March the 10th to 11th instead of March 21st. This mattered for the church. Here it gets tricky, right? This mattered for the church because the Council of Nicaea had set rules that Easter should be celebrated on the Sunday after the first full moon following the spring equinox. If the equinox was slipping, Easter was drifting off its intended date. And remember, Easter really means Eshram. It's one of their ancient gods and stuff, right? So it's just curious why they had to correct the record. So what they do, Pope Gregory the 13th commissioned astronomers and mathematicians, notably Christopher Clausius and some other dude, to realign the calendar. So they skipped 10 days, Thursday, October the 4th, 1582, and was followed by Friday, October the 15th, 1582, in Catholic countries. They also refined leap years. Century years would no longer be leap years unless divisible by 400. So 1600 and 2000 were leap years, but the years 1700, 1800, and 1900 were not. So this correction realigned the calendar with the spring equinox. The main motivation was to restore Easter to the correct seasonal point, as set by these Nicaea rules. So anyways, Catholic countries adopted the reform right away in 1582. Protestants and Orthodox regions adopted it later, some centuries later. For example, Britain was in 1752, and Russia didn't adopt it until 1918. Lots of reasons to be suspicious about this calendar, but I really don't have the strength to go any wild chairs on the calendar today, but just putting that out there. So let's take a look at some of these timelines, my favorite things, a good structured timeline. So where'd we start out? Well, this is the timeline that's going to include the Benai birth, Zionism, and the founding of Israel, which covers between 1843 in 1948, about 100 years, right? But not that long ago, right? For the crowd yelling, "Oh, it's so long ago." 1948. I was born in 1951, so this was just a hop and a skip from when I was born. So how do we look at this? Well, we should always look at the root. How did all this stuff get going? And that is where the story gets very fascinating. So right off the bat, our very first place, I got here because I was originally looking at the Anti-Defamation League, right? Because they're all over protecting Israel, and the ADL is the one who is bringing people over to Israel on these tours. The ADL is the one who's training the cops to be more violent. The ADL has a really big role in all this. And that's how I got started. But of course, I had to figure out, well, how did the ADL get started? And that's where it got interesting. So 1843, another fascinating time frame, right? Right around that Gilded Age time when the Gypsies took over. 1843, Benai Birth was founded in New York City by, you'll never guess, German Jewish immigrants. The purpose, a fraternal organization, mutual aid, Jewish communal defense. What was a deeper role? Building a global Jewish network of influence and coordination. By the late 19th century, B'nai B'rith had established lodges in Europe and Palestine, created an organization backbone before Zionism formally emerged. By 1862, Moses Hess publishes this thing called Rome and Jerusalem. Here again, Rome, right? Like those good Roma gypsies. So Moses Hess, that's Hess, publishes Rome and Jerusalem, a proto-Zionist work envisioning a Jewish homeland. Right there in his mind, I'm envisioning a Jewish homeland. Well, I thought this happened thousands of years ago, but anyway, so you got to watch out when you start out lying. Okay, then the 1870s to the 1880s, they started having persecution and those pogroms over in Russia. The pogroms just mean uprisings against the Jews. So very easy to coordinate an uprising against the Jews, right? Bring in your agents, break out a bunch of Jewish merchants' windows, and there you got yourself a pogrom. It's Pogrom, and that is a big deal because what they did, this is what I'm guessing they did, they just needed to whip things up over Russia. So 1870 to 1880s, conveniently around the Gilded Age, right? Persecution and pogroms in Russia and Poland. Interesting area, right? Fuel Jewish migration and nationalist stirrings. Gee, what a cause and effect is that little doozy, right? Wow. Then 1881, pogroms in the Russian Empire escalate, radicalizing Jewish communities. Then they had all these things called these alaya, Allyah, and they came over in shifts, okay? So I think there were 4 or 5 of these alayas, but we'll straighten that out just in a little bit here. But so 1882, this is critical. After they whipped up these people getting beat and breaking some Jewish people's merchant windows and stuff. So 1882, right on the heels of that, to 1903 is what they're calling the first alaya. Those were the first pioneers from Russia, Poland, and Romania migrate to Ottoman Palestine. Early agriculture settlements were founded. 1884, Lovers of Zion group called Hobel Zion, founded in Russia. Excuse me. 1884, Hobel Zion, which means Lovers of Zion, was founded in Russia. Gee, isn't that amazing? Right where those people were. A grassroots proto-Zionist movement. Then 1896, just 12 years later, Theodore Herzl publishes this thing called Der Jugendtag. It crystallized modern political Zionism. See, imagine all these dates, right? Then 1897, the first Zionist Congress. And where was it? In Basel, Switzerland. I wonder if that Otto Habsburg had anything to do with it since he was hanging around Switzerland. So 1897, the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. Launch of the World Zionist Organization, or the WZO, 1897. Then we had the second Ayala. And the second Ayala, I'm having trouble with words. The second Ayala was from 1904 to 1914. And of course, this was sparked by the 1903 Kishinev pogrom. And then leaders like David Ben-Gurion from Poland arrived in 1906 into Israel. And then Yitzhak Ben Zivi from Ukraine arrived in Palestine in 1907. Imagine that. A big thing gets sparked in 1903, and the early Zionist leaders end up going into Palestine. They bring socialist Zionist ideals, founding kibbutzim, unions, and defense groups. People are always on the lookout to defend themselves, aren't they? 1909, founding of Tel Aviv. Oh, wait a minute. I thought this stuff was there for thousands of years. The first modern Jewish city. 1913, that freak you heard in the intro? We're not up to anything. That Star of David means peace. Well, That freaks group got started, the Anti-Defamation League, or the ADL, 1913, founded in the United States by B'nai B'rith in response to anti-Semitism. There's this case called the Leo Frank case, and I will be getting way into that in a bit. Leo Frank case was the torch that set this thing off. They claimed a good Jewish man happened to have raped a young girl. Well, that started the whole fireball rolling. Did he rape the girl? Yeah, I'm pretty sure he did. These people are all criminals, right? So that was what triggered the founding of the ADL, a good white guy raping a young girl that worked for him in his factory. Of course, he was Jewish, so yeah, nobody could have seen this coming, right? And then, of course, 1917, right after the 1913 ADL was founded, the Balfour Declaration. Britain supports a Jewish national home in Palestine. Gee, this stuff is just working out like clockwork. So then, 1919 to 1923 was a third aliyah, and 40,000 Jews from Poland, Russia, Ukraine, Lithuania arrived. Activists, they were activists influenced by the Russian Revolution. Well, yeah, of course, they always have to have a cause and effect, right? And the foundation was laid for this thing that happened in 1920. 1924, they had the fourth aliyah, where 80,000 Jews, mainly Polish middle-class families, arrived, and Tel Aviv expands. 1929 to 1939, yeah, the fifth aliyah. I think there were only five, and that was a big one. And this was all before the war was done, okay? 1929 to 1939, they were already pumping people like mad dogs into Israel. That the fifth aliyah had 250,000 Jews driven by the Nazi rise in Germany. Gee, this stuff has such cause and effect. Am I in a Groundhog Day episode or what? So the 250,000 Jews, they were getting word of the Nazism was rising in Germany, right? When Hitler was shaving off that mustache and becoming one with the common man. Yeah, so the first stages of Hitler drove, let's see here, 250,000 of them into their senses, and they got out of there, right? And that was when Golda Meir, she was born, or he, I'm pretty sure that was a man. I mean, my God, look at Golda Meir. Golda Meir was born in Kiev and migrated in 1921. So yeah, this fifth aliyah really brought in a lot of them. The 1930s, many future leaders like Ben-Gurion, Weizmann, Begin, Golda Meir are active in Palestine, having roots in Eastern Europe. So, 1939 to 1945, Holocaust devastates European Jews. Despite British restrictions, they had the White Paper of 1939, illegal migration continues. Survivors attempt to reach Palestine, and many are detained by the British. So they started really cutting people off about that time frame. So the final push to statehood, 1945 to 1948. 250,000 Holocaust survivors from Poland, Romania, and Hungary. Gee, sounds like a bunch of gypsies if you ask me, in displaced persons camps. So what happened was a big group of them, they threw them into camps, okay? So because a Zionist underground group supported the illegal immigration. So yeah, they've always played all sides, right? In 1947, the UN partition plan proposes, now that they've already stolen the land, okay, then they say, well, tell you what, maybe we'll give you half of the land. It's like saying, I took your entire house, but why don't I let you and your family live in the garage? So 1947, the UN partition plan proposes division of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. And that is how long this thing has been going on. May 14th, 1948, State of Israel is declared by David Ben-Gurion, the Polish guy, Polish-born guy. The founders included Chom Weissman from Belarus, Golda Meir from Ukraine, Maken Begin from Poland, almost all rooted in Eastern Europe. So B'nai B'rith, 1843, was the root of this thing, right? Zionism, 1890, became their engine. The ideological movement born in Russia and Poland. The ADL, 1913, became their shield. It was the advocacy, especially in the U.S. The migration, 1882 to 1948, successive Eastern European, they kept releasing those aliyahs. Israel, 1948, statehood declared, led by Eastern European-born leaders carrying socialist Zionist ideals. By 1948, survivors and Eastern European Jews were fully integrated into the new state of Israel, completing a century-long trajectory that began with B'nai B'rith in 1843. Yeah, nothing planned or fishy about any of this stuff. So, the anti-black roots of the ADL. The Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith has an international reputation as a respected Jewish civil rights organization. Among other things, it keeps track of hate groups. I'm sorry, there's a lot of irony in all this, right? The psychopaths in charge, the most hateful group of people ever to exist on the planet, are in charge of hate groups. So let me try to get myself straightened around here, keep reading. So the ADL, among other things, it keeps track of hate groups, a monitoring which in the cyber age has extended to the internet. In his 1997 book Conspiracy, Middle East watcher Daniel Pipes speaks favorably of the ADL, claiming that for relief from these many hate mongers, the Anti-Defamation League provides original research and documentation, primarily but not exclusively about anti-Semitic groups. And this person went on to say, well, Pipes is either a dupe, a mischief maker, or a fellow traveler. For any objective investigation of the activities of the ADL reveals it to be anything but a panacea for intolerance, none more so than an investigation of its origins. The inspiration for the Anti-Defamation League was the Leo Frank case. The story as it is usually related is that the ADL was founded in response to the anti-Jewish bigotry excuse me. The ADL was founded in response to the anti-Jewish bigotry engendered by the trial and subsequent lynching of the totally innocent Frank, who had been scapegoated by the wicked anti-Semitic bigots of the Deep South for a senseless murder which no Jew could possibly have committed. As with many Jewish tragedies, though, particularly those which emerged out of World War II, there is a canyon-wide gap between the legend as it is portrayed in the fawningly phileo-Semitic media and its academic lackeys, and a cold appraisal of the salient facts. Leo Frank was a Jew who was convicted of the murder of a young factory worker at the Atlanta, Georgia pencil plant, which he managed, which was known as the National Pencil Company. He was sentenced to death, reprieved, then lynched by a gang which broke into the gaol where he was being held and kidnapped him for that purpose. Jewish author Leonard Denelstein refers to this case as one of the most infamous outbursts of anti-Semitic feelings in the United States, and comparisons have often been made with the Dreyfus case in France, In fact, the conviction of Leo Frank for murder, if not his subsequent lynching, was more indicative of a lack of racial bigotry on the part of white Southerners and bigotry on the part of Frank's supporters, many of them Jewish. After Mary Fagan, a young white girl, not quite 14, 5 weeks shy of 14, born on June the 1st, 1899, was found battered to death in the early hours of April 27th, 1913. And this date is also the date I was born, April 27th. So anyway, so Mary Fagan, a young white girl, not quite 14, was found battered to death in the early hours of April 27th, 1913, by the plant's Negro watchman. It quickly became clear, and by the way, I'm going to be using terms of the time, and they used Negro then. I haven't become some crazy racist. So. No, it quickly became clear that there were only two serious suspects: the respectable upper middle class and northerner Leo Frank, and Jim Conley, a low-class Negro of poor character and with a liking for drink. Frank was the last person to admit seeing the victim alive, and Conley was the principal witness against him. Conley claimed to have helped Frank cover up the murder, and in spite of his antidotes, he made a good impression on the jury. It is doubtful, though, if Frank's expensive lawyer made such a good impression, because with his client on trial for his life, he disparaged Conley in the most vile terms, asking the jury how could they, decent white people, convict a respectable white businessman like Frank on the word of a black man. It was absurd. Luther Rossner suggested that the word of a filthy criminal lying Negro should be taken in an effort to hang a man. Who is Conley? Well, who was Conley as he used to be? And have you seen him? He was a dirty, filthy, black, drunken, lying nigger. Who was it that made this dirty nigger come up here looking so slick? Why didn't they let you see him as he was? What could be better calculated to alienate a jury of 12 ordinary decent people? So Arthur Dennison doesn't seem to realize the lawyer's folly any more than Frank's legal team and supporters did themselves. But another Jewish author, and an uncharacteristically impartial one, saw things very differently. The distinguished American scholar Nathan Weil wrote in his books, The Jew in American Politics, that 5 members of prominent Jewish families were on the grand jury, which indicted Frank, and most Atlanta Jews seem to have at first believed him guilty. This was something which tends to be forgotten nowadays as the incessant wailing and whining which always accompanies any allegations of Jewish wrongdoings. Another Jewish academic whose commitment to historical truth outweighs his commitment to fighting anti-Semitism, a Professor Lindman, who in his excellent book, Esau's Tears, candidly admits that Frank's innocence was less clear at the time of the trial than many accounts have suggested. Summarily, anti-Semitism seems to have been of marginal importance in both his arrest and conviction. He adds, too, that Frank had a stiff and distant personality and an odd appearance, which rightly or wrongly clearly lent credence to some of the scurrilous gossip that was circulated about him at the time. Whether or not Frank should have been convicted is a totally different matter. Most people, including the current writer, would consider it dangerous to convict any man, of so grave a crime as murder solely on the word of a man of the character of Jim Conley, who had not only admitted in helping cover up the crime, but had lied repeatedly to the police. But the suggestion that a white man should not have been convicted simply because his accuser was black would have alienated most jurors, even white Southerners in those days, especially when couched in such terms. There were more than 200 defense witnesses, most of them white and of good character, and many of them swore that Conley was a damn liar. Yet the jury preferred the testimony of a low-class Negro to that of a white man of good character. Not even Doreen Lawrence could find racism in that. Just as his lawyer undoubtedly alienated the jury, so too did Frank's many wealthy Jewish supporters alienated large tracts of the public by persistently playing the race card, and drew comments like, "Are we to understand that anybody except a Jew can be punished for crime?" And it is a bad state of affairs when the idea gets abroad that the law is too weak to punish a man who has plenty of money. Or Jim Conley was sentenced to a year on a chain gang for his part in the crime and lived to a ripe old age, apparently unmolested by the supposedly so bigoted Southerners, whom we are frequently led to believe would lynch a Negro simply for looking at a white girl, much less for murdering one. In those days, lynchings were not uncommon, including of whites, mostly for rape. To this day, Leo Frank remains the only Jew ever to have been lynched in America, and indeed, he was the first white man to have been brought to trial in the Deep South on a capital charge solely on the word of a Negro. The police appeared sincerely to have believed Frank guilty, and uncharacteristically, they didn't manufacture evidence of his guilt as their contemporaries often do today. With regard to the testimony of Jim Conley, one newspaper questioned whether this illiterate Negro had conceived and fitted together such a set of detailed circumstances without some foundation in fact. Commenting 50 years after the case, McClellan Smith, who covered the story as a cub reporter, wrote that a man of Conley's mental capacity could have been broken if he was lying. He certainly impressed on the witness stand, as Conley spent a total of 16 hours undergoing an intense cross-examination. This was no mean feat. Either he was an accomplished liar par excellence, or he was indeed telling the gospel truth. Dennerstein himself cites a letter held by the University of Chicago in the Julius Roswell papers, in which an unnamed author gives cogent reasons for his belief in Frank's guilt. Another newspaper pointed out paradoxically that there was a considerable body of evidence for and against Frank. The campaign to clear Frank's name, and by implication to clear the name of the Jew, was eventually successful, although one can't help but think it was accomplished by sleight of hand. By 1982, 67 years after Frank was lynched, a supposed eyewitness came forward. At the time of the murder, Alonzo Mann was 14 years old. Mann, who was white, claimed to have seen Conley disposing of Mary Fagan's body, but kept quiet at the time, and for more than half a century afterwards out of fear. "If you ever mention this, I'll kill you," Conley is supposed to have said, according to Mann, when recounting his story to a Nashville newspaper. There is no doubt that Mann was there. He attended the trial, but just how much credibility can be placed on his belated Nashville confession? One might ask the rather obvious question, cui bono? The ADL and other Jews continued their agitation, and in March 1986, Frank was pardoned. So yeah, years later they cooked up this fake story. So in 1986, this whole Frank case got pardoned. Whatever the claims, echoed by the ADL and its fellow travelers to this very day, that the trial of Leo Frank was a calculated sentence exercised in racial bigotry, continues with not a grain of truth. But this is hardly surprising because the ADL's prestigious reputation has been manufactured largely by the ADL itself. For many years, the ADL's remit has stretched well beyond combating anti-Semitism, which in any meaningful sense has long since ceased to exist in contemporary America, and has ended up poking its unwanted nose into the activities of bona fide political and campaigning organizations for the overt purpose of political and racial gerrymandering. One method of perpetuating the phony struggle against anti-Semitism is to smear all and sundry as anti-Semite. A 1964 ADL hatchet job, Danger on the Right, written by two of its staffers, attempted to smear extreme conservatism as anti-Semites. 1/5 of the American population would fall under this. In 1992, an ADL survey echoed these sentiments. They said 1 out of 5 Americans were said to hold strong prejudicial attitudes against Jews. Of the earlier comment, Wiles writes, the Anti-Defamation League, or ADL, supposedly exists to refute slanders against the Jewish people and promote tolerance among the non-Jewish majority. It is difficult to believe that the best way of bringing this about for the national chairman of the ADL is to slander some 20% of the American people as associates of kooks, bigots, and yahoos. This sentiment is echoed by Rabbi Alan Miller in an essay on Black anti-Semitism. They wrote, Jews who resent generalized collective slander should be hyper cautious about making generalized collective slander against other ethnic groups are concerned. So, and there's where we get to, I've talked ages ago, I had read that the Civil War flag came from the Scottish Rite, and here I have the evidence, finally. So, Benign Birth, founded in the 1840s, was influenced by the Scottish Rite, those Freemasons, and it exhibited pro-slavery sympathies during its early years. So yeah, they were pro-slaves. Yeah, of course they wanted to slave all of us, right? The ADL, established in 1913 as a branch of the Benign Birth, has defended Pike's statue and sought to suppress discussion of his clan ties. So here's what the thing is. Albert Pike, you know, the very famous Freemason person, right? Well, come to find out, Albert Pike, I think he connects to the KKK, but let me keep reading him. I'm a little fuzzy today. So, the most recognizable Civil War flag today is the Confederate battle flag, the blue white Andrews cross with white stars on a red field. That St. Andrew's cross is also the national symbol of Scotland. And remember, they play those Scottish bagpipes at all their funerals and stuff, right? When cops and stuff die, they play those Scottish bagpipes. I talked about that years ago. But Scottish Rite Freemasonry uses many layers of Scottish symbolism, and critics have noticed the overlap. By the mid-1800s, you know, the period that we're in around the Civil War, the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry had strong lodges in both the North and the South. And Albert Pike, who was a Confederate general and high-ranking Scottish Rite Mason, became sovereign Grand Commander of the Southern jurisdiction. and that was his Charleston headquarters. Pike wrote extensively on Masonic symbolism, including the meaning of the cross and the banners. So, was the Confederate flag a Scottish Rite design? Well, no surviving documents say, well, the Scottish Rite designed the flag, but the saltire, which is the X cross, and remember, they just changed Twitter to X. X means a lot to these freaks, okay? So the saltire, S-A-L-T-I-R-E, which is the name of that X cross, was chosen in 1861 for the battle flag by William Poshner Miles. He argued a cross was distinctive from the Union stars and stripes. Some historians note that Masonic networks influenced Southern elites, and the Scottish Rite symbolism of St. Andrew's Cross was already familiar. Andrew Pike, in particular, embodied the overlap Confederate leader and top Scottish Rite Mason. So the St. Andrew's Cross equals the Scottish heritage, knightly symbolism, and martyrdom. For the Confederacy, it carried a sacred cause framing, tying Southern rebellion to a higher, almost mystical struggle. For the Scottish Rite, it was already embedded in Masonic ritual and degrees. So while not officially a Scottish Rite flag, it carried visual resonance with Masons in the South would have recognized instantly. Both Union and Confederacy were saturated with Freemasons at leadership levels. Civil War iconography like flags and monuments and rituals drew on a shared pool of biblical, medieval, and Masonic imagery. The Confederate flag saltire, or that X, may not have been given by the Scottish Rite, but it symbolically fit their world perfectly. So the Confederate battle flag was not officially, like no known documents claiming it, but its design, the St. Andrew's Cross, comes straight out of the symbolic vocabulary of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. With Albert Pike and other Masons in leadership, it's no surprise that the imagery overlap. So, anyhow, so yeah, this was a whole big roundabout setup, right? I'm gonna just start reading here. I don't know. I found another article. I'll start reading and see if we'll continue. Although I have long recognized the power and influence of the ADL, a leading Jewish activist organization whose officials were so regularly quoted in my newspapers until rather recently, I had only the vaguest notion of its origins. I'm sure I'd heard the story mentioned at some point, but the account had never stuck in my mind. Then, perhaps a year or two ago, I happened to come across some discussion of ADL's 2013 centennial celebration, in which the leadership reaffirmed the principles of its 1913 founding. The initial impetus had been the vain national effort to save the life of Leo Frank, a young Southern Jew unjustly accused of murder and eventually lynched. In the past, Frank's name and story would have been equally vague in my mind, only half remembered from my introductory history textbooks as one of the most notable early Ku Klux Klan victims in the fiercely anti-Semitic Deep South of the early 20th century. However, not long before seeing that piece on the ADL, I read that Albert Lindman's highly regarded study called The Jew Accused and his short chapter on the notorious Frank case had completely exploded all my preconceptions. First, Linderman demonstrated that there was no evidence of any anti-Semitism behind Frank's arrest and conviction with Jews, and with Jews constituting a highly valued element of the affluent Atlanta society of the day, and no reference to Frank's Jewish background, negative or otherwise, appearing in the media prior to the trial. Indeed, 5 of the grand jurors who voted to indict Frank for murder were themselves Jewish, and none of them ever voiced regret over their decision. In general, support for Frank seems to have been strongest among Jews from New York and other distant parts of the country, and weakest among the Atlanta Jews with best knowledge of the local situation. Furthermore, although Linderman followed the secondary sources he relied upon in declaring that Frank was clearly innocent of the charges of rape and murder, the facts he recounted led me to the opposite conclusion, seemingly to suggest strong evidence of Frank's guilt. When I much more recently read Linderman's longest and more comprehensive historical study of anti-Semitism called EU's Tears, I noticed that his abbreviated treatment of the Frank case no longer made any claim of innocence, perhaps indicating that the author himself might have also had second thoughts about the weight of the evidence. Based on this material, I voiced my opinion in my recent article on historical anti-Semitism, but my conclusions were necessarily quite tentative, since they relied upon Linderman's summary of the information provided in the secondary sources he had used, and I had the impression that virtually all those who had closely investigated the Frank case had concluded that Frank was innocent. But after my piece appeared, someone pointed me to a 2016 book from an unexpected source arguing for Frank's guilt. Now that I have ordered and read that volume, my understanding of the Frank case and its historical significance has been entirely transformed. Mainstream publishers may often reject books that too sharply conflict with reigning dogma, and sales of such works are unlikely to justify the extensive research required to produce the manuscript. Furthermore, both authors and publishers may face widespread vilification from a hostile media for taking such positions. For those reasons, those who publish such controversial material will often be acting from a deep ideological motives rather than merely seeking professional advancement or monetary gain. As an example, it took a zealous Trotsky leftist such as Lenin Brenner to brave the risk of ferocious attacks and invest the time and effort to produce his remarkable study of the crucial Nazi-Zionism partnership in the 1930s. And for similar reasons, we should not be totally surprised that the leading book arguing for the guilt of Leo Frank appeared as a volume in the series on the pernicious aspects of Jewish-Black historical relationship produced by Louis Farrakhan's Nation of Islam, nor that the text lacked any identified author. Anonymous works published by heavily demonized religious political movements naturally engender considerable caution, and once I began reading the 500-page book of the Leo Frank case, The Lynching of a Guilty Man, I was tremendously impressed by the quality of the historical analysis. I think I have only very rarely encountered a research monograph on a controversial historical event that provided such an enormous wealth of carefully argued analysis backed by such copious evidence. The author seemed to display complete mastery of the major secondary literature of the last 100 years, while drawing very heavily upon the various prime sources, including court records, personal correspondence, and contemporary publications, with the overwhelming majority of the 1,200 footnotes referencing newspaper and magazine articles of that era. The case they made for Frank's guilt seemed absolutely overwhelmingly true. The basis outline of events is not disputed. In 1913 Georgia, a 13-year-old pencil company worker named Mary Fagan was last seen alive visiting the office of factory manager Leo Frank on a Saturday morning to collect her weekly paycheck, while her raped and murdered body was found in the basement early the next morning, and Frank was eventually arrested for the crime. As a wealthy young president of the Atlanta chapter of B'nai B'rith, see, this is where it gets catchy, right? So Frank was actually the president of the B'nai B'rith Atlanta chapter, okay? Nothing fishy about this, right? Frank ranked as one of the most prominent Jewish men in the South, and great resources were deployed in his legal defense. But after the longest and most expensive trial in state history, he was quickly convicted and sentenced to death. The facts of the case against Frank eventually became a remarkable tangle of complex and often conflicting evidence and eyewitness testimony, with sworn statements regularly being retracted and then counter-retracted. But the crucial point that the authors emphasize for properly deciphering this confusing situation is the enormous scale of the financial resources that were deployed on Frank's behalf, both prior to the trial and afterward, with virtually all of the funds coming from Jewish sources. Current currency conversions are hardly precise, but relative to the American family incomes at the time, the total expenditures by Frank supporters may have been as high as $25 million in present-day dollars, quite possibly more than any other homicide defense in American history before or after, and an almost unimaginable sum for the impoverished Deep South of that period. Years later, a leading donor privately admitted that much of his money was spent on perjury and similar falsifications, something which is very readily apparent to anyone who closely studies the case. When we consider this vast ocean of pro-Frank funding and the sordid means for which it is often deployed, the details of the case become far less mysterious. There exists a mountain of demonstrable fabricated evidence and false testimony in favor of Frank, and no sign of anything similar on the other side. The police initially suspected the black night watchman who found the girl's body, and he was quickly arrested and harshly interrogated. Soon afterwards, a bloody shirt was found at his home, and Frank had made several statements that seemed to implicate his employee at the time. At one point, this black suspect may have come close to being summarily lynched by a mob, which would have closed the case. But he stuck to his innocence and stories with remarkable composure, in sharp contrast to Frank's extremely nervous and suspicious behavior, and the police soon shifted their scrutiny toward the latter, culminating in his arrest. All researchers now recognize that the night watchman was entirely innocent and the evidence against him was planted. The case against Frank steadily mounted. He was the last man known to have seen the young victim, and he repeatedly changed important aspects of his story. Numerous former female employees reported his long history of sexually aggressive behavior toward them, especially directed toward the murdered girl herself. At the time of the murder, Frank claimed to have been working alone in his office, but a witness who went there reported he had been nowhere to be found. A vast amount of circumstantial evidence implicated Frank directly. A black Frank family servant soon came forward with sworn testimony that Frank had confessed the murder to his wife in the morning after the killing, and this claim seemed supported by the latter's strange refusal to visit her husband in jail for the first 2 weeks after the day of his arrest. 2 separate firms of experienced private detectives were hired by Frank's lavishly funded partisans, and the agents of both eventually came to the reluctant conclusion that Frank was guilty as charged. As the investigation moved forward, a major break occurred as a certain Jim Conley, Frank's black janitor, came forward and confessed to having been Frank's accomplice in concealing the crime. At the trial, he testified that Frank had regularly enlisted him as a lookout during his numerous sexual liaisons with his female employees, and after murdering Pagan, Frank had then offered him a huge sum of money to help remove and hide the body in the basement so that the crime would be pinned upon someone else. But with the legal noose tightening around Frank, Conley had begun to fear that he might be made the new scapegoat and went to the authorities in order to save his own neck. Despite Conley's damning accusations, Frank repeatedly refused to confront him in the presence of the police, which was widely seen as further proof of Frank's guilt. By the time of the trial itself, all sides were agreed that the murderer was either Frank, the wealthy Jewish businessman, or Conley, the semi-literate black janitor with a first-grade education and a long history of public drunkenness and petty crime. Frank's lawyers exploited this comparison to the fullest, emphasizing Frank's Jewish background as evidence for his innocence and indulging in the crudest sort of racial invectivism against his black accuser, whom they claimed was obviously the true rapist and murderer due to his bestial nature. Those attorneys were the best that money could buy, and the lead counsel was known as one of the most skilled courtroom interrogators of the South. But although he subjected Conley to a grueling 16 hours of intense cross-examination over 3 days, the latter never wavered in the major details of his extremely vivid story, which deeply impressed the local media and the jury. Meanwhile, Frank refused to take the stand at his own trial, thereby avoiding any public cross-examination of his often changing account. 2 notes written in crude black English had been discovered alongside Pagan's body, and everyone soon agreed that these were written by the murderer in hopes of misdirecting suspicion. So they were either written by a semi-literate black man such as Conley or by an educated white attempting to imitate that style. And to my mind, the spelling and choice of words strongly suggest the latter, thereby implicating Frank. Taking a broader overview, the theory advanced by Frank's legion of posthumous advocates seems to defy rationality. These journalists and scholars uniformly argue that Conley, a semi-literate black menial, had brutally raped and murdered a young white girl, and the legal authorities soon became aware of this fact, but conspired to set him free by supporting a complex and risky scheme to instead frame an innocent white businessman. Can we really believe that the police officers and prosecution of a city in the Old South would have violated their oath of office in order to knowingly protect a black rapist and killer from legal punishments and thereby turn him loose upon their city streets, presumably to prey on future young white girls? This implausible reconstruction is particularly bizarre in that nearly all of its advocates across the decades have been the staunchest supporters of Jewish liberals who have endlessly condemned the horrific racism of the Southern authorities of that era, but then unaccountably choose to make a special exception in this one particular case. In many respects, the most important part of the Frank case began after his conviction and death sentence, when many of America's wealthiest and most influential Jewish leaders began mobilizing to save him from the hangman. They soon established the ADL as a new vehicle for that purpose and succeeded in making the Frank murder case one of the most famous in American history to that date. Although his role was largely concealed at the time, the most important new backer whom Frank although his role was largely what happens is that I've taught myself how to read ahead as I'm reading along. So sometimes I'll read ahead and I'll remember something that I wrote that was pretty funny. But I'm still reading this person's article. But yeah, what they wrote here is pretty funny. So let me start over. Although his role was largely concealed at the time, the most important new backer whom Frank attracted was Albert Lasker of Chicago, the unchallenged monarch of American consumer advertising, which constituted the life's blood of all of our mainstream newspapers and magazines. Not only did he ultimately provide the lion's share of the funds for Frank's defense, but he focused his energies upon shaping the media coverage surrounding the case. Given his dominant business influence in that sector, we should not be surprised that a huge wave of unremitting pro-Frank propaganda soon began appearing across the country in both local and national publications, extending to most of America's most popular and highly regarded media outlets, with scarcely a single word told on the other side of the story. This even included all of Atlanta's own leading newspapers, which suddenly reversed their previous position and became convinced of Frank's innocence. Lasker also enlisted other powerful Jewish figures in the Frank cause, including New York Times owner Adolph Oakes, American Jewish Committee President Louis Marshall, and leading Wall Street financier Joseph Schiff. The Times, in particular, began devoting enormous coverage on this previously obscure Georgia murder case, and many of its articles were widely republished elsewhere. The New York Times authors the book authors highlight this extraordinary national media attention. The black janitor, whose testimony became central to Leo Frank's conviction, became the most quoted black person in American history up until that time. More of his words appeared in print in the New York Times than those of the Booker T. Washington combined. Back a century ago, just as today, our media creates our reality, and with Frank's innocence being proclaimed nationwide in near unanimous fashion, a long list of potential public figures were soon persuaded to demand a new trial for the convicted murderer, including Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, and Jane Addams. Ironically enough, Lasker himself plunged into this crusade despite apparently having very mixed personal feelings about the man whose cause he was championing. His later biography reveals that upon his first personal meeting with Frank, he perceived him as a pervert and a disgusting individual, so much that he even hoped that he managed to free Frank. So much that he even hoped that so much that after he hoped that he had managed to free Frank, the latter would quickly perish in some accident. Furthermore, in his private correspondence, he freely admitted that a large fraction of the massive funding that he and numerous other wealthy Jews from across the country were providing had been spent on perjured testimony, and there are also strong hints that he explored bribing several judges. Given those facts, Lasker and Frank's other major backers were clearly guilty of serious felonies and could have received lengthy prison terms for their illegal conduct. With the New York Times and the rest of the liberal northern media now providing such heavy coverage of the case, Frank's defense team was forced to abandon the racially inflammation rhetoric aimed at his black accuser, which had previously been the centerpiece of the trial strategy. Instead, they began concocting a tale of rampant local antisemitism, previously unnoticed by all observers, and adopted as a major grounds for their appeal of the verdict. The unprincipled legal methods pursued by Frank's backers is illustrated by a single example. Georgia law normally required that a defendant be present in court to hear the reading of the verdict, but given the popular emotions in the case, the judge suggested that this provision be waived, and the prosecution accused only if the defense lawyers promised not to use this small irregularity as grounds for appeal. But after Frank was convicted, Atlanta President Marshall and his other backers orchestrated numerous unsuccessful state and federal appeals on exactly this minor technicality, merely hiring other lawyers to file the motion. For almost 2 years, the nearly limitless funds deployed by Frank's supporters covered the costs of 13 separate appeals on the state and federal level, including the U.S. Supreme Court, while the national media was used to endlessly vilify Georgia's system of justice in the harshest possible terms. Naturally, this soon generated a local reaction, and during this period, outraged Georgians began denouncing the wealthy Jews who were spending such enormous means to subvert the local criminal justice system. One of the very few journalists willing to oppose Frank's position was Georgia publisher Tom Watson, a populist firebrand, and in an editorial, he reasonably declared, "We cannot have one law for the Jew and another one for the Gentile," while he also later lamented it is a bad state of affairs when the idea gets abroad that the law is too weak to punish a man who has plenty of money. A former Georgia governor indignantly inquired, "Are we to understand that anybody except a Jew can be published for a crime?" The clear facts indicate that there was indeed a massive miscarriage of justice in Frank's case. All appeals were ultimately rejected, and Frank's execution date for the rape and murder of the young girl finally drew near. But just days before he was scheduled to leave office, Georgia's outgoing governor commuted Frank's sentence, provoking an enormous storm of popular protest, especially since he was the business partner of Frank's chief defense lawyer, an obvious conflict of interest. Given the enormous funds that Frank's national supporters had been deployed on his behalf and the widespread past admissions of bribery in the case, there obviously were dark suspicions about what had prompted such a remarkably unpopular decision, which soon forced the former governor to exile himself from the state. A few weeks later, a group of Georgian citizens stormed Frank's prison, abducted and hanging him, with Frank becoming the first and only Jew lynched in American history. Naturally, Frank's killing was roundly denounced in the national media that had long promoted his cause. But even in those quarters, there may have been a significant difference between public and private sentiments. No newspaper in the country had more strongly championed Frank's innocence than the New York Times. Yet, according to the personal diary of one of the Times editors, the founder privately despised Frank and perhaps even greeted lynching with a sense of relief. No effort was ever made by Frank's wealthy supporters to bring any of the lynching party to justice. Although I have now come to regard this volume of book as the most persuasive and definitive text on the Frank case, I naturally considered conflicting works before reaching this conclusion. So yes, for nearly half a century, the leading scholarly account of the incident had probably been Leonard Dinerstein's book, The Leo Frank Case, first published in 1966. So yeah, I'm gonna keep moving. I'm gonna put this on hold here, and I need to keep these shows to around this time frame. So what I'm gonna be doing is putting on hold, and then I'll come back and decide how much longer I'll still be able to go for today. Okay, so I think why did this sound so weird? Sometimes I don't know why it changes between recordings, but it does. So anyway, so I started off 8 years ago and I actually had a show manager. He adjusted the sound. All I did was I would record my shows, get it to him on Sunday. By Tuesday, it'd all be live. I had no interaction in between. It was just all done for me. I just sat back, and now I'm like scrambling to get it done. So because I'm having some pretty strong issues here, so I'm really trying to record what I know while I can record it in a reasonable manner. So the Anti-Defamation League, or the ADL, was birthed to defend a murdering child rapist, financed by mass murdering terrorists and organized crime, narcotics peddling, and gun-running psychopaths, formed the pro-Zionist organization fully called the ADL. The ADL has been caught spying through American police departments, spying on American citizens, and even coaching American police on what they should be on the lookout for and for how hate crime means anything that Israel doesn't like. And this is their biggest weapon, the ADL. People have been giving the information online. Naturally, the ADL has been censoring such journalists, all the while screaming anti-Semitism. AIPAC bribes Congress and the ADL censors the media. So that's how it really works. AIPAC is their bribery arm, and the ADL is the one who censors and is a strong arm. It is a 1-2 punch to protect criminal Zionist interests. So that is all it is a mafia division within this whole group here, right? The ADL versus the KKK. They were working together very early on. The ADL, they began documenting Klan members, and the Klan members are very interesting, and I'll be getting to a little bit more of the history of the Klan, but the Klan members, right there on themselves, have the exact same logos. So they always work both sides. And in this case, ADL was one side, and the Ku Klux Klan was the other side, right? So they're all working together in this strange little deal they have set up. So in the early 1920s, the ADL then begins documenting Klan members and activities. And they had cooperation with journalists and law enforcement to expose violence and intimidation. And the early reports they circulated to policymakers and newspapers. Then, of course, after the 20s, we had the civil rights movement from the 50s to the 70s. And there, the KKK violence against civil rights activists, churches, and synagogues. And the ADL during that era partners with the FBI, another reliable group, and local police to track and infiltrate Klan groups. So this thing they're doing now, after 9/11, they set up all these fusion centers all around the United States to track U.S. citizens that they deem as terrorists. And of course, full disclosure, I'm somewhere in that mix, right? I consider myself a nice old lady living in Nebraska. The U.S. government considers me a radical terrorist. So, and this is how it all gets going. So anyway, I think the terrorist surveillance they're doing right now, they're patterning what they're doing right now after what they did with the Ku Klux Klan when they were running that sort of the team. Because of the Ku Klux Klan, you've heard of David Duke. David Duke is one of the royal actors. So this is all just a big stage thing, right? Get those Klan members out there in those white hoods and stuff, whip up fear of black people, then the ADL. It just all works together, right? So both the ADL and the KKK frame themselves as defenders of heritage or identity, but with radically opposing missions. KKL sought to preserve white Protestant dominance. ADL fought to dismantle barriers for Jews and later partnered in broader civil rights causes. So, some of the controversies, accusations that ADL shared intelligence with police in ways that reinforce racial profiling. Lawsuits in the 1990s alleged ADL improperly collected data on activists, including Arab Americans and pro-Palestine groups. Well, of course they are. It raises questions. When does defending against hate cross the surveillance overreach? Well, we're already there. Today, ADL continues to monitor extremist groups, including the fragmented remnants of the KKK, the group they themselves set up. So the KKK was once powerful, is now splintered, marginalized, but still a symbol leveraged by other extremist groups. So the paradox is this: the ADL's fiercest enemy, the Klan, also shaped ADL's role as an information broker for law enforcement. Just like 9/11, they had all those plans for 9/11, the I can't remember what you call it. The peaceful plans that were coming out of 9/11, the ones to entrap all of us. That was all written up before they even fake bombed in the first place. So um, this stuff is just all organized. So anyway, where was I here? Yeah. So strange intersections of surveillance, civil rights, and extremism continue to echo in today's debates around hate, free speech, and state power. So yes, it's also you know, it's how the first thing got set up with the second one, because really it started with the Civil War, 1861, um, American Civil War, Union versus Confederacy. Here again, black versus white, right? Massive casualties, 620,000 to 750,000. And keep those numbers in mind because a lot of children got taken from this event, but not for today. But anyways, 1863 Emancipation Proclamation issued by Lincoln. 1865 end of the war. In 1865, the Ku Klux Klan was founded in Tennessee in the chaotic post-war South. Gee, isn't that interesting, right? So 1865, the first Ku Klux Klan was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee. 1871, the first U.S. Congress passed Ku Klux Klan Act. 1915, the second Klan was revived. And this is where it gets interesting because what happened was the Klan was buzzing along earlier, okay, with their little Scottish Rite flag, right? And then they got revived again. When did they get revived again? Well, they got revived again during this deal with this guy raping the young girl. Um, so the second 1915, the second Klan, Ku Klux Klan, was revived in Georgia after Birth of a Nation. That movie came out. That movie was I talked about that movie years ago. That movie, Birth of a Nation, it all got, the theme of the movie was some black men looked at white women, and then all heck broke loose. That was the theme of that movie, which really ties into all this stuff, right? Because that Frank case, he was looking at a black, they were all tying in black people to this stuff. Any black man that looked at a white woman that was going to get accused of rape. But yeah, uh, so the second Klan emerged in the 1950s, conveniently around the time of the ADL, right? And the 1920s was peak Klan membership. They had about 4 to 5 million of them. 1940s to the 1950s, the Klan resurges targeting civil rights activists. And let me see here. Yeah, so what they did was they basically set up the Ku Klux Klan, and then they had somebody to fight, right? So the B'nai B'rith started the ADL, and they were the ones who organized with the Catholics to stop the Jews who killed the Jesus deal, right? See, they're all running in circles. So I'm going to be closing this off soon here. I think you get the picture of how the ADL got started, right? And I have a lot more that I will be saying later about when these people um, were migrating around. And So, yeah, and also the ADL also connects to the mafia because we had all those mafia people. The early founders of the mafia were people like Lansky and them, right? And they came from Russian Poland. Um, so yeah, the early mafia people came out of Russia and Poland, and I'll have that next when we get to these people more specifically. But um, some investigative writers, often critical of the ADL, argue that Lansky, the mafia guy, and other Jewish mobsters gave financial backing or quiet support to Jewish defense organizations, including the ADL, especially during the 1930s and 40s when Jewish gangsters fought against pro-Nazi groups. And that was exactly how that happened too, because these Jewish gangsters who came out of Russia and Poland, Eastern Europe, they provided the strong arm. So I know it's so convoluted. So when people would be protesting against the Nazis or something, they would go in and break up the fights and stuff. So they were really the strong arm for the whole thing. Um, so, but the ADL was officially founded in Chicago, home of all the mobsters and stuff. Chicago, that whole area, the Ashkenazi Jews and the mobsters are really out of that Chicago area. I'm reading that book called a guy wrote a couple really good books. I'm still reading it. It's taking me forever. But anyway, so let's reel this back for a second. 1913, the ADL was founded in Chicago by the Jewish fraternal group B'nai B'rith after the Leo Frank case. The mission was to defend Jews against anti-Semitism and promote civil rights. And the mobsters, we had Meyer Lansky, Butsy Siegel, and all of them. So in the 1930s, the ADL expanded as anti-Semitism rises in America. It builds its reputation as a mainstream advocacy group. So Lansky and other Jewish gangsters, they attack pro-Nazi Bund rallies in New York in the 30s. So yeah, it's such a crazy circular thing going on, right? So the 1940s to the 50s, from ADL's official history, they push civil rights agenda. They have campaigns against anti-Semitic hiring practices. They work with the FBI and police on hate crimes, sometimes controversial because of their surveillance ties. Lansky was it, yeah, I'll get into more of that later. But anyway, so in the 60s and 70s, they focused more on civil rights and they expanded their international monitoring of anti-Semitism. Uh, and even Lansky, when he got into trouble here, he fled to Israel by the law of return. Yeah, anyway, so they all, it's kind of like a ball of wax here going on. So, yeah, the mafia came in and did beat people up in the streets over stuff. They used street defense against the Nazis. Mayor Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Longley Zillerman, and other Jewish mobsters mobilized gangs to smash up German American Bund rallies in New York and New York. New York and Newark. At the same time, ADL and B'nai B'rith were lobbying and using the courts to fight anti-Semitism. See, that's why I'm always saying, mafia gangsters help funnel money and arms in British mandated Palestine. Yeah, they were right in there. Figures like Lansky and them contribute to arms smuggling operations into Israel. Mainstream Jewish organizations, including B'nai B'rith and ADL networks, also fundraise for Zionist causes. Both mob and civil donors fed into the same Zionist pipeline. The one side was public, the other was underground. The ADL was known to share intelligence with the FBI, police, and sometimes foreign intelligence agencies. Jewish mobsters often worked in gray zones with CIA, OSS veterans, and Mossad-linked arm dealers. Both the ADL and mob intermediaries participated in intelligence sharing networks, one officially, the other covertly. Yeah, Lansky fled to Israel under the law of return in 1970, and he was deported from there. I don't know. Anyway, so yeah. So the 1980s to the present, the ADL rebrands as a U.S. civil rights watchdog. Lansky actually, another dead one in 1983. Another shame. Didn't get a chance to meet the guy. John DeCamp, that big liar, died right here in the same town I'm in. Didn't get a chance to meet him. Boy, I should make a list of the psychopaths I wish I could have met. So Lansky dies in 1983. Stories spread that he was buried with honors in Israel, a myth rooted in his earlier asylum attempts. Writers and critics began conducting dots. Mob wealth helped seed certain Zionist and Jewish defense projects, while ADL became the respectable, public-facing institution. The shadow history is not that Lansky founded the ADL, but that Jewish mobsters and Jewish defense groups often ran parallel operations against anti-Semitism and fascism. Money pipelines overlapped, donations, smuggling, intelligence, and influence sometimes blurred between gangster and civic leader. The ADL became the legitimate shield, while mobsters like Lansky operated as the illegitimate sword. But both were part of the same ecosystem of Jewish defense and Zionist fundraising. Yes, what a nice, tidy little group they were all in, right? So yeah, the ADL brought about the second wave of the Ku Klux. I don't know why I find this stuff so funny, but yes, the ADL brought about the second wave of the whole deal there. So, and I don't know why I have it here, but I need to do a whole show about those orphan train children because I found out where they came from and I found out how they got those kids out of Armenia. But anyway, so I'm gonna keep scrolling here real quick. I'm trying to get this finished up right now. So yeah, this person, Albert Pike, has long been accused of serving as a founding leader and chief judicial officer of the Ku Klux Klan. I don't know why I find this so funny, but yeah, Albert Pike, the Scottish free right Mason person, has long been accused of serving as a founding leader and chief judicial officer of the Ku Klux Klan following the Civil War. His statue in Judiciary Square in Washington, D.C. became a flashpoint for controversy. Critics argue that Pike's connection to the Klan are deliberately obscured by the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry and the Anti-Defamation League, or ADL, who downplay or deny his involvement. So Pike was a Confederate general and owner of the Memphis Daily Appeal. He was the leader of the Scottish Rite Freemasons in the South. He was pardoned by Vice President Andrew Johnson, who was later impeached despite alleged complicity in the Lincoln assassination conspiracy. Pike was also buried in the Scottish Rite Temple in Washington, D.C. So, evidence of Pike's role in the KKK, Walter L. Fleming's 105 History. Yeah, I've got all listed down below. They have history of him writing about it. Pike wrote that Southern whites needed secret association for protection, calling for a united order of Southern brotherhood, a Klan reference. Yeah, I mean, this thing goes through so many different barriers. I just don't have the ability to go through every nook and cranny. So I have all of this over my website. I hope you'll take a look. So the evidence strongly supports that Albert Pike was a senior figure in the first Ku Klux Klan, serving as its chief judiciary officer and as Grand Dragon of Arkansas. His dual leadership roles in Freemasonry and the Klan indicate that Masonic networks played a central role in structuring post-war white supremacist terrorism. Modern attempts to deny Pike's role are less grounded in historical fact and institutionalized into self-protection. So yeah, that Civil War flag was the Scottish Rite flag. And I have a couple more articles down below you might want to take a look at. One of them is the B'nai B'rith masquerades as a human rights organization. In fact, they do not allow non-Jewish Freemasons to join. Why? They are a satanic secret society dedicated to white enslavement and genocide who regard resistance as hate. So yeah, a couple of articles down there will give you the idea from that perspective. But yes, this is exactly how it all got started, right? Here's a quote from here. ADL shills for Rothschild agenda. As this is somebody else saying this, as I have said, the mainspring of the New World Order is the private central bankers' need to translate their unlimited financial power derived from their control of government credit into permanent world institutions of political and social control. Jews have sold their souls to these Luciferian-loving bankers led by the Rothschilds and by the Rockefellers. The banking cartel is behind the September 11th attacks, the Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syrian wars, and false flag terror. They are behind the B'nai B'rith, ADL. Take their diversity program, for example. You cannot work for a large corporation or government today without receiving the insulting Stalinist indoctrination which forces us to embrace human differences regardless of their merit. A measure of the Masonic control of Western society is that diversity was never debated or put to a vote. It became official ideology as if by magic. Particularly distasteful is the ADL's early childhood education, which targets 3- and 5-year-olds for indoctrination. They hide behind a smokescreen of platitudes, but the net effect is that youngsters of European origin do not learn pride in their national cultural heritage. The ADL boasts that 375,000 teachers and 12 million students have participated in these programs. In the workplace, diversity discriminates against Europeans and particularly white heterosexual roles by favoring women, coloreds, and homosexuals. People are chosen on the basis of their political profile instead of their competence. So yes, the B'nai B'rith ADL doesn't represent Jews. It represents Masonic Jewish bankers who plot the demise of Western civilization. And that is the whole plan. The few of them want to enslave the majority of the rest of us. So, yes, and I will have a lot more to say about these Ayatollahs or whatever these things are, and how these people got moving over there, and because they really they first started their first lodges in Poland, right? B'nai B'rith, founded in New York in 1843, but then when they left the United States and set up lodges, the first ones were in Poland. By the 1880s and 1890s, B'nai B'rith lodges were established in Polish territories, then partitioned between the Russian Empire, Austro-Hungary, and Prussia. These lodges drew heavily on the German Jewish model, emphasizing mutual aid, cultural uplift, libraries and lectures, philanthropy, and relief programs for the poor. They were particularly active in Galicia, southern Poland, then part of Austro-Hungary, where Jews had relatively more freedom to organize. After Poland regained independence in 1918, B'nai B'rith expanded rapidly. Dozens of lodges operated in major Polish cities, including Warsaw, Krakow, and Lutsk. Membership was concentrated among assimilated, middle-class, German-speaking or Polish-speaking Jews. They had cultural programs, concerts, and educational scholarships, advocacy for Jewish rights in the new Polish Republic, cooperation with international B'nai B'rith bodies to counter anti-Semitism in Poland and abroad. So, after the Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939, all B'nai B'rith lodges were dissolved. Many members were deported, murdered in ghettos, or sent to concentration camps. B'nai B'rith organizational infrastructure in Poland was effectively wiped out by the Holocaust. Interesting turn of events, right? Anyway, I have a lot more down below and on my website as far as all these lodges and when they did this and when they did that, but I am going to need to close off this thing. So yeah, I think we get the picture straight. B'nai B'rith, 1843, New York City. The founders, 12 German Jewish immigrants, led by Henry Jones. So yeah, that was how it got started, to create a mutual aid society for Jewish immigrants, provide sick benefits, burial assistance, widow and orphan support. And the name of B'nai B'rith means sons of the covenant in Hebrew. Covenant, you hear that word? Coven. B'nai B'rith means sons of the covenant in Hebrew. It spread to New York, from New York to Philadelphia, Cincinnati, Chicago, St. Louis, and later to Canada, Europe, and other Ottoman Palestine territories. It functions, the lodge offered insurance, disaster relief, and advocacy for Jewish rights abroad. It was modeled partly on Masonic rites, but explicitly Jewish. ADL creation in 1930, leaders under B'nai B'rith founded the ADL to counter anti-Semitism and defend civil rights. Between world wars and World War II, Europe, lodges became Jewish representative bodies in civil life. Relief work, they were mobilized to aid Jewish refugees to fight anti-Semitism. Boy, they really got it going, didn't they? Post-war era, 1945 to 1970s. The Holocaust response, they were right there to bury that deal, right? They assisted with restitution, remembrances, and rebuilding communities. Israel, strong support for the new state of Israel. Civil rights, expanded role in interfaith dialogue and civil rights movements in the U.S. So in the modern shift between the 80s and the 2000s, they moved into things like senior housing. They built one of the largest Jewish-sponsored affordable housing networks for seniors in the United States. They have an NGO role. They became an international NGO with offices at the UN, OSCE, European Parliament, and Latin America. And that just got going in the 1980s to 2000s. Doesn't sound like a long time ago to me. To present, headquarters, Washington, D.C., of course, global hubs, Jerusalem, Brussels, Good morning, Brussels. In Latin America. What a shock, huh? What a shock. Brussels is in here, their headquarters. Huh. Just stunning information. So, focus areas today: humanitarian relief and disaster aid, senior services and housing advocacy, global anti-Semitism monitoring, Israeli relations and public diplomacy. It is one of the oldest continuously operating Jewish organizations in the entire world, 182 years as of 2025. It transitioned from a fraternal lodge to a global NGO, retaining the mission of protecting Jewish life and welfare. Instrumental in founding the ADL and inspiring Jewish communal advocacy worldwide. So aren't they just so wonderful? This group of 12 Jewish German immigrants. Gee, I wonder why they got those people from, right? Anyway, I got all the information about who these people were, what they were doing, and how they were traveling around. And yeah, the ADL, they're the ones that are organizing all of these. And I have all their revenue down below. I'm kind of tired, so I don't want to read all their revenue because it's probably all lies, but they claim as of 2023, they have about $105.4 million. Yeah, if anybody, how the US has all these dollars, they have serial numbers on them. Do you really, do you really believe that they say that, well, there's this many dollars in circulation? Well, do you really think that's true? Just like, do you really think there's gold at Fort Knox? I mean, come on, when their mouths are moving, they're probably lying, right? And if they're on the screen, they're probably likely on the team. So yeah, so I got all their foundation information down below. I'm not going to wear myself out repeating it because they all connect. Silicon Valley. This is eugenic central, right? This is just a new ship. These are the people that are really enforcing enforcing the eugenics on the rest of us, right? This is their club. This is exactly their club. So anyway, so benign birth financing has always rested on a dual base. There was old German Jewish banking and mercantile elites from the 19th and 20th century foundations. Now we have modern billionaires and family foundations like Bronfman, Lauder, Tisch, and the Schutermans. Much like the much like the ADL, it presents itself as a membership-based nonprofit. But in reality, it is the financial backbone and is concentrated among major Jewish American philanthropists and federations with close ties to APAC and ADL networks. And that is how they all work together. Hold on a second. So, I hope to be back with it and carry this on from the time that um, they were over in over in Eastern Europe and going over into and the whole thing with this Khazarian mafia. I'll be back with all of that. Because the Khazarian mafia was what integrated with all the stuff that it was just way, way, way too much to talk about today. Um, so this brings us to the end. We've seen how organizations, movements, and hidden forces shape the long journey from Eastern Europe to the founding of Israel in 1948. History often carries a double face, one that promises safety and another that hides control. And I'll remind you, the wolf doesn't scare the flock when it wears his shepherd's cloak. Evil always comes dressed as help. Until next time, be safe out there and goodbye for now.